The crisp mountain air of Shadow Ridge carried the scent of pine and damp earth, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. It was a place of solitude, a refuge from the past. At least, that's what Rebecca Becca Steele had told herself when she settled here 3 years ago. Nestled deep in the Colorado wilderness, Shadow Ridge Training Facility was more than just a dog training center. It was a fortress disguised as an ordinary sanctuary, a place where she could train service dogs for law enforcement and search and rescue operations, while keeping the ghosts of her past at bay. Becca exhaled slowly, her breath misting in the early morning chill. Rogue, her sleek Belgian Malinois, sat beside her, ears pricked forward, eyes locked onto the tree line, a silent observer. Echo, her loyal German shepherd, stood alert near the training course, his massive frame blending into the shadows. Titan, her Rottweiler, was the muscle of the trio, positioned closer to the cabin, his dark gaze sweeping the property. They felt it too, a shift in the air, a disturbance in the stillness. Becca adjusted the worn leather straps of her training gloves, forcing herself to focus on the present. Today's training exercise was meant to be routine, tracking drills, scent work, endurance training. But routine had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Something was wrong. It started subtly. A week ago, a drone had passed over her property, silent, precise. Not the kind a teenager would play with, but something more sophisticated, the kind used for surveillance. A few days later, she found boot prints near her northern fence line, the kind left by someone who knew how to move unseen, but had miscalculated just enough for her trained eyes to catch. Then, last night, Titan had growled, a deep, low warning in the dead of night. And Titan never growled unless there was a reason. Becca didn't believe in coincidences. The town of Green Hollow, about 10 miles down the mountain, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. She wasn't exactly close to the locals, but she made sure to blend in. She grabbed coffee at Maggie's diner, picked up supplies at the hardware store, and exchanged nods with the sheriff when their paths crossed. To them, she was just another veteran looking for a quiet life. What they didn't know was that Becca Steele wasn't just any veteran. She had once led an elite K-9 combat unit deployed on the most dangerous missions across enemy lines. Her team specialized in operations that never made the news, high-value extractions, deep reconnaissance, and counter-terrorism raids where silence and precision were the difference between survival and becoming a forgotten name on a memorial plaque. And she had walked away from it all, not because she wanted to, because she had to. A mission gone wrong, a betrayal. The cost? 2 of her teammates. One of them, Connor Hayes, had been like a brother to her. The other, her K-9 partner, Ghost, had been more than just a dog. He had been her shadow, her protector, her lifeline. Losing them had shattered something inside her. So she had done the only thing that made sense. She disappeared. Until now, until the past started creeping back in. Becca ran a hand through her dark auburn hair, pulling it into a tight ponytail. Her instincts screamed at her to prepare, to take this seriously. But for what? A drone? Footprints? A bad feeling? If this had been overseas, she wouldn't have hesitated. She would have assumed the worst and moved accordingly. But this was Colorado, not a war zone. At least it wasn't supposed to be. A sharp chirp from her motion sensor drew her attention. Someone, or something, had just crossed the perimeter. Not an animal. Too controlled. Too deliberate. Rogue was already on his feet, muscles coiled, waiting for her signal. Echo followed suit, positioning himself near the side gate. Titan let out a quiet huff, a deep sound of restrained power. Becca moved swiftly to the small control panel hidden inside her porch railing. With a quick press of a button, a series of hidden cameras activated, streaming live feeds to her tablet. The northern fence line. That's where the disturbance had come from. She tapped the screen, zooming in. A man in a leather jacket stood just outside the property line, facing her cameras directly, as if he knew exactly where they were. He wasn't trying to sneak around. He wanted her to see him. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 motorcycles were parked near the tree line, their riders waiting in silence. Not moving, not talking, just watching. Becca's pulse remained steady, but her mind went into high alert. She zoomed in further, her gaze locking onto the patch on the man's jacket. A coiled serpent wrapped around a skull. Iron vipers. She had heard the name in whispers at Maggie's diner. A rising outlaw motorcycle gang making its way through the Northwest, moving fast and taking over small towns like wildfire. Protection rackets, smuggling operations, quiet takeovers. And now they were here, on her land. Rogue let out a barely audible growl, Echo's ears flattened slightly, and Titan took one slow, heavy step forward. They knew. They could feel it in her body language. Becca exhaled, steadying herself. She needed to play this right. This wasn't just some random visit. The fact that they were here, standing just outside her perimeter, meant they already knew who she was. Or at least, they thought they did. The leader of the group, the man in the leather jacket, raised a hand in an almost friendly gesture before calling out, "Miss Steele, right? We need to talk." His tone was polite, almost casual, but Becca heard the underlying current beneath it. The kind of voice that expected obedience. She kept her expression neutral, stepping off the porch with measured ease, making sure they saw the well-worn tactical holster on her hip, but not reaching for it. Yet. "Private property," she called back, voice calm but firm. "You're trespassing." The man grinned, a slow, knowing smile. "Not yet, ma'am. Just standing on public land, having a friendly conversation." He took a single step forward. Rogue stiffened. Echo's tail gave a slight flick, a signal, a warning. Titan didn't move. He didn't need to. Becca tilted her head slightly, reading the situation. They weren't here for small talk. This was a test, a show of force disguised as a casual meeting, and she wasn't about to fail it. She let the silence stretch between them, the weight of unspoken tension settling like a thick fog. The man held her gaze, waiting for something. Becca finally spoke, voice even, deliberate. "Whatever it is you think you're going to find here, you won't." His smile didn't fade. "Oh, I think we will," he said smoothly. "And I think you're going to want to hear what we have to say." Becca exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The storm was coming, and Shadow Ridge was about to become a battlefield. The man in the leather jacket didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, that same knowing grin stretched across his face, too confident, too at ease. Becca recognized the type. She had seen them before, in war zones, in interrogation rooms, in the places where power was currency and intimidation was a language. She had learned early on that men like this didn't make polite visits. They came with intentions. Becca kept her stance relaxed, but her mind was already running calculations. The 2 bikers near the tree line hadn't shifted position, but she noticed one of them subtly adjusting his jacket, probably checking a concealed weapon. The leader, however, carried himself differently. His body language suggested military training, even if his posture screamed outlaw. A former soldier, maybe special forces. That made things more complicated. "Like I said, Miss Steele," the man continued, voice carrying across the open space between them. "We're just here to talk. You've got quite a place here, quiet, isolated, secure. You ever think about what happens when someone decides they want it more than you do?" Becca didn't flinch. Rogue, standing beside her, let out a barely audible growl, more vibration than sound. The tension in the air thickened. The man chuckled, unbothered. "Relax, I'm just making an observation. You're out here all alone. Well, except for your dogs. Bet they're real loyal, aren't they?" His gaze flickered to Titan, who stood stone still, watching his every movement with unblinking intensity. Big boy there looks like he could tear a man apart. Question is, would he get the chance? Becca smiled, a slow, deliberate, razor-sharp smile. You'd be surprised how fast he moves, she said simply. The man's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. He was testing her, trying to push buttons, trying to see how far he could edge into her space before she pushed back. Becca had played this game before. Only last time, the players weren't criminals. They were enemy combatants, and she knew exactly how to win. She took a single step forward, just enough to shift the balance of power between them. I don't know who you are, she lied, her tone calm, measured, almost bored. And I don't care. But here's what I do know. You don't drive all the way up to my land just to chat. So either say what you came to say or get back on your bikes and leave. Silence. The man studied her, weighing his next words. Then, with a mocking tilt of his head, he sighed. You know what? You're right, he said, voice all smooth edges and false politeness. Let's skip the small talk. Name's Clayton Briggs, but my friends call me Iron. Maybe you've heard of me? Becca didn't answer, but she had. Iron Briggs, leader of the Iron Vipers, a ruthless operator with a history of military service that had ended in a dishonorable discharge. A man who had built his organization from a handful of ex-soldiers, turned mercenaries into one of the fastest-growing outlaw groups in the Pacific Northwest. And now he was standing at her front gate, talking like he already owned the place. Becca crossed her arms, keeping her face unreadable. Never heard of you. Iron chuckled again, shaking his head. I like you, Steele. Straight to the point. No nonsense. That's good. Makes this easier. He took a step closer. The tension in Titan's shoulders tightened. See, we're expanding, Iron continued. We like places like this, remote, easy to defend, good sight lines. And you, well, he gestured vaguely at her. You seem smart enough to know how these things work. People like me? We make offers. Smart people take them. You strike me as smart. Becca's stomach clenched, but she didn't let it show. Iron Briggs wasn't just trying to buy her out. He was offering her a choice, compliance or consequences. She had one chance to set the tone. Not interested, she said flatly. Iron's smirk vanished. For a moment, the silence between them was almost deafening. Then one of the bikers near the trees shifted just slightly, his hand drifting toward his waistband. Before he could blink, Rogue lunged. Not an attack, just a warning, a sharp, controlled snarl as he took a half-step forward, just enough to let the man know that one more movement would be his last. Iron raised a hand. Easy there. No need to get twitchy. But his eyes had darkened. Becca tilted her head, as if considering something. Then she took another step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to make him uncomfortable. You see those cameras? She asked softly. You see the sensors lining my fence? You think I live out here alone because I'm scared? Because I need protection? She leaned in just slightly. You don't get to where I am without knowing how to handle men like you. Iron held her gaze. He wasn't smiling anymore. For the first time since he arrived, he looked unsure. Becca watched the shift, the flicker of doubt that passed through his expression before he buried it beneath his mask of confidence. Then, after a long beat, he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like he was disappointed. Shame, he said. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. He turned back toward his bike, motioning for his men to follow. But before he climbed on, he cast a look over his shoulder. You've got 24 hours to reconsider, he said, voice casual but layered with warning. After that, things might start getting complicated. Then, without another word, he and his men roared away, the sound of their motorcycles tearing through the morning silence. Becca stood there, watching the dust settle. Rogue, Echo, and Titan remained frozen at her side, their battle-ready instincts humming in the air like a live wire. She exhaled slowly. She had pushed back, and Iron Briggs didn't like being pushed, which meant the next time he came back, he wouldn't come alone. She needed to prepare. She needed backup. And she knew exactly who to call. The dust had barely settled from Iron Briggs' departure, but the weight of his words lingered like a storm cloud over Shadow Ridge. You've got 24 hours to reconsider. After that, things might start getting complicated. Becca didn't need 24 hours. She already knew exactly how this was going to play out. Iron Briggs wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. He had shown up at her property not just to test her, but to send a message. Shadow Ridge wasn't hers anymore. It was his for the taking, and that was his first mistake. Becca took a deep breath, steadying her mind. Her training had ingrained this into her. Never react, always respond. Panic got people killed. Strategy kept them alive. She turned her attention to Rogue, Echo, and Titan, all three dogs still locked onto the direction the bikers had disappeared. Their ears twitched at every distant noise, their bodies coiled with controlled tension. They felt it too. The shift, the inevitable fight that was coming. Becca exhaled slowly and pulled out her phone. It was time to activate her network. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Becca, what's wrong? Ethan Carter wasn't the type to ask about the weather. A former Army scout and one of the few people she trusted, Ethan had an instinct for trouble, and he could hear it in her silence before she even spoke. Iron Briggs was just here, Becca said, cutting straight to the point. He wants Shadow Ridge. A beat of silence. Then, that's bad. Yeah, she agreed, and it gets worse. He gave me 24 hours to reconsider before things get complicated. We both know what that means. Ethan's tone shifted, sharpening. How many? 3 here today, but that was just the opening move. They weren't just testing me, they were watching, calculating my response. Next time, they'll come bigger. She heard Ethan move on the other end, the sound of something metal clicking. You want me to bring the toys? Not yet, Becca said. I need to see how deep this runs first. But I do need eyes in town. Can you start watching their movements? See if they've set up shop anywhere? Ethan let out a low hum. Already ahead of you. There's been talk at the auto shop about some new faces hanging around the Green Hollow Motel. Not just bikers, ex-military types. Doesn't feel like a coincidence. It wasn't. Nothing ever was. Then let's assume they're planning something bigger than just taking my land, Becca said. Find out who else they're leaning on. If anyone in town is already working with them, I need to know. Copy that, Ethan replied. I'll check in soon. She hung up and turned to Titan, giving the silent hand signal for watch perimeter. The Rottweiler immediately took off toward the tree line, moving like a ghost despite his massive frame. One call down, one more to make. The second number she dialed was even more secure. It took 4 rings before Monica James picked up. Tell me you're calling to invite me to a barbecue and not because you're about to start a war, the voice on the other end drawled. Becca snorted. No barbecue, but war might not be far off. There was no humor in Monica's sharp exhale. She knew Becca well enough to know this wasn't an exaggeration. Who? Monica asked, all business now. Iron Briggs. A low curse from Monica's end. That's worse than a war. You're telling me. Becca paced along her fence line, her eyes scanning the treetops, looking for anything out of place. He wants Shadow Ridge. He's not going to ask nicely again. Did you play it smart? Monica asked. Becca smirked. Let him think I'm just a stubborn ex-military dog trainer with more pride than sense. Let him underestimate me. Monica let out a knowing hum. Good. Keep that up. Men like Briggs get cocky when they think they're in control. The moment he thinks you're scared is the moment he makes his first real mistake. Becca nodded, even though Monica couldn't see her. I need a favor. Name it. Can you pull federal records on Iron Viper's recent activity? I want to know who they're working with, where their money's coming from. Something tells me this isn't just about my land. Monica exhaled sharply. That's a dangerous question to ask, Becca. Yeah. Well, Becca murmured, glancing at Rogue, who was still locked in alert mode. I don't think safe is an option anymore. A beat of silence. All right, Monica said finally. I'll see what I can dig up, but Becca, be careful. If Briggs is in bed with bigger players, this could get out of control fast. Becca knew that. She also knew that letting them take control wasn't an option. Just get me what you can, she said. And Monica? Yeah? If anything happens to me, make sure they don't win. Another pause. Then, softer this time. They won't. I promise. She ended the call and let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders to release the tension creeping in. Now came the hard part. If Iron Briggs was watching her, and she was certain he was, he needed to believe she was rattled. So she staged the perfect performance. She made sure to be seen driving into town, stopping by Maggie's diner, ordering coffee with shaking hands and a nervous glance over her shoulder. She walked into the hardware store and bought reinforced locks, extra security cameras, making sure the cashier noticed how frantic she seemed. She parked in front of the sheriff's office, sitting in her truck for 5 full minutes before driving away without going inside, just enough to make it look like she had thought about asking for help but decided against it. She was building a narrative, one that Iron Briggs would believe. A woman alone, afraid, weighing her options. Let him think he had her right where he wanted, because by the time he came back to collect, she'd be ready, and he'd never see it coming. The cold Colorado night wrapped around Shadow Ridge like a veil of silence, but Becca knew better than to trust the stillness. Silence wasn't safety. It was the pause before the storm. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the tree line, beyond the flickering motion sensors she had deliberately left unpatched, they were watching. She could feel it. The itch at the base of her skull, the whisper of something just out of sight. Iron Briggs was testing her, and she was about to test him back. Becca crouched beside Titan, feeling the steady rise and fall of the Rottweiler's breath. His ears twitched, listening, waiting. Rogue and Echo had already slipped into the shadows, moving with trained precision through the underbrush, their black tactical harnesses blending seamlessly into the night. Good boys, she thought. They knew the drill. They had done this before, in another life, in places where the wrong move meant not coming home. Tonight, Shadow Ridge would become a battlefield. The first sign of movement came at 2:13 a.m., a shadow against the tree line, a flicker of motion where there should be none. Becca adjusted the thermal scope of her rifle, scanning the dark shapes beyond her fence. 3 men, maybe more. Their patterns were disciplined, methodical, ex-military, just like Briggs. She watched as they moved toward her property, careful, precise, checking blind spots, avoiding obvious lines of sight. They were good, not good enough. You should have sent more men, Briggs, Becca thought. She gave a silent hand signal. From somewhere deep in the forest, Rogue responded with a low, near-inaudible growl, his way of confirming what Becca already knew. 6 intruders, armed, coordinated. Iron wasn't waiting for the 24 hours to expire. He was already making his move. Fine, so was she. The first man never saw it coming. One moment he was moving toward the fence, weapon raised. The next, Echo was on him, silent, swift, a ghost in the night. The German Shepherd took him down without a sound. The only noise a muffled grunt before Becca saw his heat signature disappear from her scope. 1 down. The second man went next. Rogue darted from the brush like a shadow, taking the intruder's weapon arm first, his bite powerful enough to send the rifle clattering to the ground. Before the man could react, Becca was there, pressing the muzzle of her sidearm against his temple. "Shh," she whispered. "Not a sound." He froze. Becca could feel his pulse hammering beneath her grip. She didn't need to say anything else. The cold look in her eyes said enough. 2 down. The remaining 4 had noticed something was wrong. They adjusted, moving into defensive positions, their previous confidence starting to waver. They weren't expecting this, Becca realized. They thought they were coming to scare a lone woman into submission. Instead, they had walked into her world. A voice crackled over their radios. Iron's voice. "What's taking so damn long? Report!" Silence. Then one of the men made a fatal mistake. He turned to respond. The moment he took his focus off the battlefield, Titan struck. The massive Rottweiler barreled into him, knocking him off balance. The man fired a shot into the ground, panic overriding training. 3 down. The sound shattered the silence. Becca moved. She pressed her advantage, slipping between cover with the kind of fluidity that only came from years of combat experience. The last 3 intruders hesitated, their former confidence replaced by uncertainty. "You don't know who you're fighting, do you?" Becca thought. She took down the 4th man with a well-placed strike to his knee, followed by a swift elbow to the jaw. He dropped instantly. 4 down. The remaining 2 men retreated toward the tree line, trying to regroup, but Becca had spent years studying how men like this operated. She knew exactly what they would do next. "Briggs," she said softly, pressing the radio she had lifted off one of the fallen men. Silence. Then his voice came through, tense, controlled. "Steel." Becca smiled. "Bad night for your guys," she said casually, stepping over one of the unconscious intruders. "How many did you send?" 6? That's cute." A pause. Then, "You think this is over?" "No," Becca admitted, glancing at Titan, who was still standing over the downed man, teeth bared. "I think this was you testing the waters, seeing how soft I'd gotten." She knelt, retrieving the wallet off one of the men. Inside, a fake ID. "Let me guess," she continued. "These aren't even your best guys, are they? Just expendable grunts. Cannon fodder." Briggs didn't respond, but Becca could hear his breathing, hear the way the silence stretched too long. She had hit a nerve. Good. "You know what's funny?" she added. "You came here thinking I was just a stubborn dog trainer." She let that hang for a moment. "You have no idea what I am, do you?" More silence. Then his voice, low and measured. "I do now." Becca smirked. "Good. That makes this next part more fun." She clicked the radio off and turned to Rogue, who was waiting patiently at her side. "Time to send them a message," she murmured. The 2 remaining intruders had almost reached the trees. Almost. Becca gave a sharp, quiet hand signal. Titan and Rogue moved as one. The 2 men barely had time to react before a blur of black fur and controlled fury took them down. 6 down. Becca let out a breath, rolling her shoulders. Her heartbeat was steady, her mind calm. Iron had made his move. Now it was her turn. She picked up the radio again. "Briggs," she said. Silence. She let her next words hang in the frigid air, letting them settle deep into whatever part of him still thought he had control. "Next time, send more men." And then she turned off the radio. Let him sit with that. Becca knew Briggs wouldn't let this go. His pride wouldn't let him. He would come back, with more men, with better men. But that was fine, because by then, she would be ready. The first streaks of dawn painted the Colorado sky in shades of crimson and steel. But there was no peace in the morning light. The battle at Shadow Ridge was over, yet the weight of what had transpired hung in the air like the remnants of gunpowder. Becca stood at the edge of her property, eyes scanning the tree line where the last of Iron Briggs's men had disappeared into the night. The bodies of their fallen had already been retrieved. The wounded carried off in the dark. No sirens, no police. Briggs had made sure of that. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Behind her, Rogue and Echo remained alert, pacing in slow, deliberate movements, their bodies still wired from the fight. Titan, however, lay near the porch, his breathing shallow, his dark fur matted with blood. Not his. Becca's hands trembled as she pressed down on the bandages wrapped around Monica's side, applying pressure to the wound. "You're gonna be fine," Becca murmured, more to herself than to Monica. Monica hissed in pain but forced a grin. "Funny," she muttered. "I was just about to say the same thing to you." Ethan crouched nearby, his face lined with exhaustion as he checked over Titan. The big Rottweiler wasn't moving much, but his deep, steady breaths told Becca he was still holding on. "He took a hit for me," Monica continued, voice weaker now. "Saved my damn life." Becca swallowed the lump in her throat. Titan had thrown himself between Monica and one of the last gunmen, taking a bullet meant for her. He'd always been the protector, the wall between Becca and whatever threat loomed. Now, he was the one on the ground, bleeding. Becca clenched her jaw, fighting back the rising tide of guilt, anger, grief. This wasn't the time. "Help me get her inside," she ordered Ethan. "I need to stop the bleeding before she goes into shock." Together, they lifted Monica, careful not to jostle her wound, and moved toward the cabin. She didn't have time for grief. Not yet. Briggs would be back. Monica groaned as Becca stitched the wound. Messy, but not fatal if they played this right. The bullet had gone clean through her side, missing vital organs by inches. "Lucky," Ethan muttered, leaning against the counter. Monica chuckled weakly. "Yeah, real lucky." Becca cleaned her hands, forcing herself to focus on strategy rather than the emotions threatening to erupt beneath her skin. "They weren't here to kill me," she said finally. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "If they wanted me dead, they would have sent more. Would have made sure I didn't walk away from this." Becca exhaled slowly. "Briggs wasn't looking to destroy me. He was looking to break me." Silence. Monica shifted against the couch, wincing. "He failed." "For now," Becca admitted. "But he's not done." Briggs had tested her defenses, thrown expendable men at her to see how she'd react. Next time, he wouldn't play games. "He'll hit harder," Ethan said, reading her mind. Becca nodded. "And he won't just come for me. He'll come for the town, for anyone close to me. He'll want to prove that I can't protect them." She turned to Monica. "Did you get anything on those records?" Monica swallowed, eyes darkening. "You were right. Briggs isn't running this operation alone." She motioned toward her bag. Ethan retrieved a file, flipping through its contents. His face tightened as he skimmed the pages. "Money's coming from a shell company in Phoenix," he said. "But trace it back far enough, and it leads to a cartel." Becca's stomach dropped. "The El Lobo cartel," Monica confirmed. That changed everything. Briggs wasn't just building an outlaw empire. He was setting up a smuggling route through the mountains, using Shadow Ridge as a key location. And now that Becca had interfered, she wasn't just in his way. She was a liability. Becca pressed her fingers against her temples, thinking fast. "We need to move first," she said, "before he can regroup." "Move how?" Ethan asked. "We take the fight to him," Monica answered, a dangerous glint in her eyes. Becca hesitated. She had spent so long reacting, so long waiting for the next move. But if they waited this time, they would be at Briggs's mercy. She glanced at Titan. His breathing was still steady, but every rise and fall of his chest felt like a countdown. This fight had already cost too much. She couldn't afford to lose anyone else, but war demanded sacrifices. Becca took a deep breath. Then she looked up, eyes steeled with determination. "We're going to end this," she said. Ethan nodded. Monica, despite the pain, smiled grimly. And Rogue? He just watched, as if he had always known this was how it had to be. The battle for Shadow Ridge wasn't over, but Becca was done playing defense. Before they left, Becca knelt beside Titan, brushing her fingers gently over his fur. "You did good," she whispered. Titan huffed softly, his tail giving the weakest of wags. Becca's throat tightened. "You rest now," she told him. "I'll take it from here." Rogue lay beside him, pressing close as if understanding what was happening. Echo stood by the door, ears flicking toward the forest, sensing the storm still brewing. Becca stood, turning to Ethan and Monica. "If we do this," she said, "we finish it." No hesitation, no turning back. Because this wasn't just a fight for her land anymore. This was a fight for everyone Briggs had ever tried to control. For the people who couldn't fight back. For the ones he had already hurt. For the ones he would hurt next, if she didn't stop him. And most of all, for Titan. For Ghost. For every partner who had ever stood beside their handler, ready to give everything. She gave one final look at Shadow Ridge, then stepped off the porch. It was time to make sure Briggs never threatened anyone again. The night was thick with tension, a charged silence settling over the mountains like the final breath before a storm. Becca adjusted the strap on her tactical vest, feeling the reassuring weight of her sidearm against her hip. This was it. This was the night they ended it. Ethan crouched beside her, eyes locked onto the distant glow of headlights winding up the mountain road, Briggs' convoy. 3 SUVs, 2 motorcycles trailing behind, and more than a dozen men, armed and ready. "That's more than I expected," Ethan muttered. "They're expecting resistance," Becca said. Monica, still stiff from her wound but as sharp as ever, let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, they're about to get more than they bargained for." Rogue, Echo, and Titan stood just behind them, alert and waiting. Titan was still recovering, his movement slower than usual, but his will was unbreakable. He wouldn't sit this one out. Neither would Becca. She had spent weeks reacting to Briggs, dodging his traps, surviving his tests. But tonight wasn't about survival. Tonight was about taking back control. The convoy moved cautiously, but not cautiously enough. Becca and her team had spent the last 24 hours laying the groundwork, turning Shadow Ridge into a battlefield on their terms. The first SUV hit the tire spikes buried just beneath the dirt road. The hiss of air escaping tires was immediately followed by a sharp curse over the enemy radios. "We've got a problem! Front unit is down! Repeat, front unit is—" A controlled explosion rocked the road ahead of them, a distraction, nothing lethal, just enough to sow confusion. Then, the lights went out. Every street lamp, every vehicle headlight. The mountain road was swallowed by darkness, leaving only the red glow of taillights flickering in the distance. "They cut the power!" one of Briggs' men shouted. "Switch to thermal!" Becca gave a silent signal. The dogs moved first. Echo darted between the stalled vehicles, slipping beneath them, silent as a shadow. He ripped a rifle from an enemy's hands, his powerful jaws crushing the weapon's grip before vanishing again. Rogue followed, launching from the underbrush to slam a man into the dirt, his growl the only warning before he took him down. Becca moved in next. 1 shot, 2 shots. The first 2 enemies dropped before they even knew where she was shooting from. The convoy erupted into chaos. Briggs's men scrambled for cover, barking orders, but they were fighting blind. They didn't know where the attacks were coming from, didn't know how many enemies they were up against. They thought they were the hunters. But tonight, they were the prey. Briggs was still in the last SUV, his lieutenants taking the brunt of the fight while he stayed back, waiting to see how things played out. That was his second mistake. Becca spotted him through the thermal scope, crouched behind his vehicle, barking orders into a radio. She moved like a ghost through the darkness, Rogue at her side. 20 feet, 15, 10. Briggs turned just as she stepped into the glow of a flickering taillight, his expression shifting from anger to realization in a split second. "Steal!" Becca leveled her weapon at his chest. "Briggs!" His hands twitched toward his sidearm, but Rogue let out a low growl, muscles tensed, teeth bared. "Don't!" Becca warned. Briggs exhaled through his nose, shifting tactics. "You've got no idea what you're interfering with," he said. "You think this ends with me? There are people above me who will burn this whole town down if they have to." "Let them try," Becca said coldly. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. "You could have had a real good deal, Steele. A real comfortable life." She smirked, but there was no humor in it. "I don't do comfortable." A gunshot rang out in the distance, one of Briggs's men going down. The battle was almost over. Briggs's smirk faltered. He could hear it, the sounds of his empire collapsing. Becca stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You thought you were dealing with a stubborn dog trainer," she said. "You had no idea you were walking into a war." Briggs clenched his jaw. He knew he had lost. Becca nodded toward the dirt road behind him. "Get in your truck and drive out of here," she said. "Tell your people that Shadow Ridge is off limits. You come back, and I won't be this generous again." Briggs hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Then, slowly, he nodded. The fight was over. For now. The first light of dawn revealed the wreckage of the night before. Scattered weapons, empty vehicles, and the last remnants of Briggs's men retreating into the distance. Shadow Ridge had held. Becca knelt beside Titan, running her fingers through his fur. His wounds would heal. So would hers. Ethan and Monica stood nearby, both battered but victorious. "You think he'll actually stay gone?" Ethan asked. Becca exhaled. "Number. But when he comes back, it won't be the same fight." Monica raised a brow. "Why?" Becca looked out at the mountains, at the town beyond them. "Because now he knows what we are," she said. "And he knows what happens when you push people too far." Monica smirked. "So, what now?" Becca stood, dusting herself off. "We rebuild," she said simply. Titan huffed, pressing against her leg, his strength slowly returning. Becca looked down at him, at Rogue and Echo, at the mountain that had become her home. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person Briggs had tried to control, for the town, for the ones who had been hurt, for Ghost, for Titan, for every K9 who had ever given everything for their handler. She took one last deep breath. Then, with her dogs at her side, she walked toward the rising sun. Shadow Ridge had survived, and no one was taking it from her ever again. But in the distance, beyond the mountains, a pair of watchful eyes followed her every movement. And a phone call was placed. "She won't back down," the voice said. A pause. Then we'll make sure she does. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. At its core, Shadow Ridge. The Last Stand is more than just a story about survival, strategy, and combat. It is a story about resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between warriors, both human and canine. It is a testament to the idea that home is not just a place, but something worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you. Becca Steele's journey is one of redemption and purpose. A former soldier who once lost everything, she sought solitude in the mountains, believing she could escape the weight of her past. But true warriors are never truly done fighting, not for war, but for the things that matter. When Iron Briggs came to take what was hers, she had a choice, to run or to stand her ground. She chose to fight back, not just for herself, but for those who couldn't. At the heart of this battle are Rogue, Echo, and Titan, her K9 partners, who symbolize more than just well-trained service dogs. They represent unwavering trust, sacrifice, and the silent promise that warriors make to each other. I will stand by you no matter what. In war, human soldiers are not the only ones who bear the scars. These dogs are not just tools or weapons. They are brothers in arms, protectors, and family. Ultimately, this story speaks to the power of found family, of standing together against oppression, and of refusing to be controlled by fear. It is about never underestimating the quiet fighters, the protectors, the ones who refuse to kneel. Because in the end, it is not power that wins. It is courage, loyalty, and the will to protect what is rightfully yours. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.